Everyone knew that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, so the greatest of care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. It was her sister Josephine who took on the task. She spoke in broken sentences and veiled hints, half concealing the meaning. Mr. Mallard's friend Richards was there too. It was he who had first heard the news. He was in the newspaper office when the information of the railroad disaster was received, and Brentley Mallard's name was on the top of the list of those labeled killed. He waited only long enough to assure himself the truth of the message through a second telegram before he went to find another more tender than himself to deliver the sad news. Mrs. Mallard did not receive this news in the way that many women have received the same. Paralyzed with grief and unable to accept the truth and the significance of the message, no, Mrs. Mallard burst into tears in an instant, in full abandonment, falling into her sister's arms. And when the storm of grief had finally spent itself, she went upstairs to her room and locked the door, wouldn't allow no one to follow her. In her room, facing the open window, there was a comfortable, roomy armchair. She sank into it, pressed down by the physical exhaustion that ravaged her body and threatened to reach into her soul. Out of the window, she could see the square before her house and the tops of the trees, just starting to show the new life of spring. The sweet smell of rain was in the air, and the clouds that piled on top of each other allowed just patches of blue to show through. Down on the street, she could see a peddler with his wares and hear the sound of someone singing in the distance, the countless sparrows twittering in the treetops. She sat there. She remained quite motionless. Except every once in a while, a sob would force itself out of her throat in the way that a child who cries itself to sleep still sobs in its dreams. She was young and beautiful. She had a calm face that often showed repression, but also a certain kind of strength. Although now her gaze was dull and fixed out on one of those patches of blue. Something was coming for her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She could not say. It was too subtle and elusive to assign it a name, but she felt it. It was creeping out of the sky. It was using the sights and the sounds and the smells through her window. It was coming for her. Her chest rose and fell quickly. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was coming for her, and she was trying to beat it back with all of her will, but it was just as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. A whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips as the feeling grabbed hold of her. Free. 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 The vacant stare and the terror left her eyes and was replaced with a keen and bright look. Her heart beat faster, and the blood that coursed through her veins warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask herself if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held on to her. Her head was clear and her perception exalted. She dismissed the thought as trivial. She knew she would cry once more when she saw those kind, tender hands folded in death, and that face which had never looked upon her with anything but love, cold and gray and dead. But she also saw beyond that bittersweet moment to the years and years that would be her own, that would belong to her absolutely. There would be no one to live for her in the coming years. She could live for herself. There would be no powerful will trying to bend hers in the blind persistence at which men and women believe they have a right to impose their will over their fellows, and yet she had loved him. Sometimes. Oftentimes she had not. But what did that matter? What could love, that unsolved mystery, count for anymore when this feeling of self-assertion she realized was the strongest impulse of her being? Free. Body and soul. Free. Her sister Josephine was kneeling outside the closed door, speaking through the keyhole to her sister, Louise, please, what are you doing? You're going to make yourself ill. Louise, for heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, indeed she was not. She was drinking the very elixir of life through that open window. Her imagination was running wild, thinking of all the days, the spring and summer days that would be her own. She breathed a short prayer that life might be long. When it was just yesterday, she shuddered at the thought of her life being long. After a little while longer, she stood and opened the door for her sister. She had a kind of triumph in her eyes and unknowingly carried herself like a goddess of victory. She took her sister by the waist. The two of them went back down the stairs where Richards was waiting for them. But someone was opening the front door with a key, and when the door opened, it was Brentley Mallard who stepped over the threshold. He looked a little travel-weary. He was carrying his bag and his umbrella under his arm. He had been far from the scene of the accident and had not even known there had been one. He stood dazed at Josephine's cry and Richard's quick attempt to shield him from the view of his wife, but Richards was not quick enough. When the doctors arrived, they said that she died of a heart disease, of joy that kills. Thank you.
Hip hip!